She is just a housewife." My stepson's voice cut through the courtroom like a sharp slap. The sound of his laughter bounced off the polished walls, echoing with such force that heads turned, and even the stenographer blinked in surprise. I felt my chest tighten, my palms damp against the smooth wooden surface of the witness stand. The words stung not because of their cruelty. They were exactly what I had feared, but because of the casual ease with which he delivered them, as if my life, my sacrifices, and my years of quiet work were nothing more than a punchline. "My name is Brielle, I'm 42, and I have been a housewife for the last 15 years. But I am more than that. I have been a mentor, a guide, and yes, a stepmother to a boy who never once thought I could measure up to his father's memory. That boy, my stepson, Michael, is 22, and today, in this courtroom, he is trying to humiliate me in front of the judge, the jury, and our entire community. He thinks he can dismiss me with a laugh, but he has no idea that the quiet, patient woman he has ignored for years has already shaped more lives than he will ever imagine. Before I go further into what happened next, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want more real-life stories about family drama, emotional courage, and moments that change lives, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. You won't want to miss what happens next. Before I could respond, the courtroom grew still. All eyes turned toward the judge, who paused mid-sentence, his pen hovering above the papers before him. I noticed it immediately: recognition, a spark of something I had never expected, something subtle but unmistakable, a flicker in his eyes that said, "I know her." In that single heartbeat, I realized the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just my stepson's arrogance on trial anymore. It was the revelation of everything I had done behind the scenes, quietly, without credit or notice, now poised to speak for itself. I had never been in court like this before. Most of my life had been spent in the small, muted rhythm of raising a household, making lunches, reminding Michael of deadlines, volunteering at the night school where I tutored teens and adults who had been overlooked by the system. I had poured myself into these small acts of service, never seeking recognition, and never imagining they would one day lead me here, standing under the glare of fluorescent lights, facing the boy I had tried to love, and the judge whose gaze now pierced me with quiet acknowledgement. Michael leaned back in his chair, grinning, thinking he had already won. He had been preparing for this day for weeks, trying to ensure that the story of his innocent mistakes would paint me as a meddling, irrelevant figure, an obstacle to his freedom. He didn't know that I had anticipated his every move. I had watched him closely, the way he dodged accountability, the casual disregard for rules, and even the subtle lies he told to mask small crimes. I knew the patterns. I had seen them before in the students I had mentored at night school, students who, like him, thought the world owed them an easy path. As the court clerk called my name, my heart began to drum. I stepped forward slowly, feeling the polished floor under my feet, the whispered rustle of papers, the quiet gasp of someone realizing this might not be the typical stepmother testimony they had expected. My voice trembled only slightly as I said, "Your Honor, I'm Brielle, Michael's stepmother, and I've been part of his life for the past 10 years. I paused, letting the words hang. 10 years is a long time. 10 years of guidance, correction, and quiet mentorship that had been consistently met with eye rolls, sarcasm, and, occasionally, outright defiance. Michael's eyebrows shot up, the smug grin still plastered across his face, as if he were thinking, "This is going to be easy." But it wasn't easy for me. It had never been easy to be the stepmother in a household still haunted by the absence of his mother, to be the woman constantly compared to someone he barely remembered. It had been years of juggling his temper, his pride, his fleeting respect, and teaching the lessons he refused to learn at home or school. And yet, here I was, facing him across a courtroom where my dignity had been challenged with nothing more than a cruel laugh. I took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I continued. I've spent the past decade mentoring not only Michael, but also dozens of students at our local night school. Students who had given up hope, students who were overlooked by teachers and society alike. I've guided them through financial literacy, problem solving, and the small decisions that often mean the difference between success and failure. I mention this because the circumstances in this case mirror lessons I have taught before, lessons that Michael himself ignored. A ripple went through the courtroom. I saw it in the way the jury shifted uncomfortably, the way the attorneys straightened in their seats. Michael froze, the grin slipping for the first time. His eyes darted to me, searching for the condescension he expected, but finding only a calm certainty that disarmed him. I watched the judge carefully. He leaned back slightly, a hand resting on his chin, eyes narrowing as if recalling a memory just out of reach. Recognition flashed again in his gaze, but now it carried weight. I realized he must have seen my work somewhere, perhaps in community programs, perhaps through a student who had spoken highly of my guidance. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the subtle authority I carried was finally visible to someone who had the power to acknowledge it. The whispers in the room grew louder, but I ignored them. I focused on the truth of my words, the quiet strength I had cultivated over years of patience. "Michael," I said softly, letting my voice carry across the silence, "the choices you made were not made in ignorance. You had guidance. You had examples. You ignored them." He opened his mouth, likely to retort, to laugh again, but the judge's sharp clearing of the throat stopped him. The entire courtroom seemed to lean in, sensing that the power dynamic had shifted. The boy who had laughed at me, who had treated me as invisible, was suddenly vulnerable. I remembered a moment years ago when I first noticed the seeds of arrogance in him. He had stolen a small amount of money from a friend, convinced it was harmless, and shrugged off my guidance. I had corrected him calmly, then, showing him the consequences in practical terms, explaining what would happen if he continued down that path. He had rolled his eyes, dismissed me, and yet today that lesson, or rather my failure to enforce it earlier, had led him here. Yet I did not feel anger in that moment. I felt clarity. The years of quiet mentorship, the late nights grading papers and guiding reluctant students, the countless conversations about responsibility and integrity, all of it had prepared me to stand in this courtroom with poise. I realized the laugh, the mocking, the underestimation. It had been inevitable. What mattered was how I responded. Michael shifted in his seat, a nervous energy radiating from him now. I noticed small details, the way his fingers fidgeted with his pen, the way he avoided eye contact with the judge, the subtle trembling of his shoulders. He had underestimated me, and for the first time, he realized that his attempt to humiliate me had misfired. I straightened my back and glanced briefly at the jury. I knew that many of them were parents, familiar with the exhausting, thankless labor of guiding a young adult. Perhaps they understood what it meant to be patient, to be ignored, and to still insist on accountability. I hope they saw the truth not just in my words, but in my presence, the quiet authority of someone who had invested fully in the future of others, regardless of recognition. The judge finally spoke, his voice deliberate and calm, yet carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Ms. Brielle," he said, eyes locking with mine, "you have been recognized in the community for your mentorship. Please explain how your guidance is relevant to the case at hand." The room held its breath. I nodded slightly, gathering my thoughts. Every moment of doubt, every sarcastic remark, every ignored warning had led to this point. I would explain, not out of revenge, but out of truth. And in that moment, I realized that the laughter that had intended to diminish me had instead announced the beginning of my quiet vindication. Even as I prepared to speak, I noticed small, human reactions around me. The attorney representing my stepson exchanged a quick glance with his client, a mix of irritation and disbelief. The bailiff's eyes flickered toward me, respectful, knowing they were witnessing something rare. A stepmother no one had expected to command authority with dignity alone. And Michael, my stepson, the boy who thought this courtroom was his stage, sat frozen, realizing that the woman he mocked had become, in the eyes of the judge and the room, a force he could not ignore. I inhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs. Years of quiet, unnoticed labor, years of patient correction, and years of steadfast mentorship culminated in this single, charged moment. The laughter that was meant to belittle me had instead drawn attention to the reality of my existence, to the impact I had quietly made, and to the undeniable authority that comes not from status or wealth, but from knowledge, patience, and unwavering dedication. And as I prepared to continue, I could not resist a small, private thought. Sometimes those who laugh the loudest at others are the most unprepared to face the truth. The courtroom still held its breath after the judge's acknowledgement, but my mind drifted elsewhere, to the quiet rooms where I had spent countless nights helping others find their way. The walls of my small night school classroom had witnessed more struggles, failures, and triumphs than any courtroom could ever contain. That space, dimly lit by fluorescent bulbs that buzzed softly, had always been my sanctuary, a place where the invisible could be seen, where mistakes were not scorned but dissected and understood. I thought of the students waiting for me that evening. The moment I walked in, I would hear the familiar shuffle of shoes on the linoleum floor, the low hum of whispered conversations, and the scratching of pens across worn paper. Each desk bore its own story: a mother returning to education after years raising children, a young man who had dropped out to support his family, a woman whose confidence had been eroded by repeated failures. These people were my focus, my reason for maintaining faith in a world that sometimes ignored the quiet work of ordinary people like me. The first student who came to mind was Carla, a single mother in her late 20s. She had been embarrassed when she first arrived, hesitating in the doorway, clutching a tattered notebook as if it were armor. Her hands shook. Her voice trembled as she explained that she had failed math in high school 3 times. Yet within weeks, she was solving problems I had thought were beyond her reach, her confidence blossoming in ways that made me quietly proud. She had become a living testament to patience, to the belief that consistent guidance could illuminate even the darkest corners of someone's potential. Then there was Marcus, a teenager who had been kicked out of his previous school for constant misbehavior. At first glance, he seemed indifferent, uninterested in learning, and quick to challenge authority. I remembered the first day he sat slouched in the back, arms crossed, smirking as he muttered under his breath. But I refused to confront him with anger. Instead, I offered him small victories, problems he could solve, concepts he could master, and slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. By the end of the semester, Marcus was one of the most engaged students in the room, asking questions that surprised even me. As I stood in that courtroom, the memories of these students and countless others returned in sharp clarity. I realized that this night school, these ordinary evenings filled with chalk dust and the scent of coffee from my thermos, had become a forge for my resilience. The skills I had imparted, financial literacy, practical problem-solving, and ethical decision-making, were lessons I had given to so many, lessons I had hoped Michael would internalize but had stubbornly ignored. The irony was not lost on me. In this quiet classroom, away from the scrutiny of the world, I had wielded influence without anyone calling it power. My students succeeded quietly, one life at a time, each small triumph invisible to the outside world. And yet, that very influence had unknowingly reached into the courtroom today, drawing the judge's recognition and shifting the balance of authority in ways I had never anticipated. I remembered one particular evening that had shaped my approach with every student. A young man named Thomas had arrived, clutching a crumpled resume he had written after a string of job rejections. His confidence had been shattered by repeated failures, and he had come to the night school with the unspoken expectation that he would fail again. I spent hours working with him, breaking down each section of his resume, discussing interview techniques, and practicing scenarios that would make him feel prepared. By the end of the semester, Thomas had landed a stable job, a small but meaningful victory that reminded me why I had dedicated myself to this work. Moments like these, repeated hundreds of times, had built my quiet credibility that now seemed to whisper its authority across the polished courtroom floor. Even now, I could recall the smell of worn textbooks, the faint hum of fluorescent lighting, and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards that protested under the weight of eager students. There was a rhythm to these nights, a pattern of patience and repetition that eventually yielded growth. The classroom had been my laboratory, testing ground, and sanctuary all at once, and the lessons I taught were as much about life as they were about academic success. I had learned to see potential where others saw only failure, to nurture it gently until it could no longer be ignored. And yet, despite my success with so many students, Michael had remained immune to my efforts. I remembered specific evenings when I had tried to sit with him, worksheets spread across the kitchen table, explaining concepts patiently while he scrolled on his phone or shrugged off my questions. "I don't need this," he would say, smirking. "I'm fine." His casual dismissal had cut deeper than any insult, and still I had persisted. There was a quiet, stubborn part of me that refused to give up on him, even when it felt like the effort was wasted. The memories continued to flow, vivid and precise, as if the courtroom had become a lens through which the entirety of my night school work was projected. I recalled another student, Elise, a woman in her 30s returning after years caring for her elderly parents. She had been terrified of mathematics, convinced that she was incapable of learning. I spent nights creating customized exercises, patiently guiding her through each step. One evening, as she solved a particularly difficult problem, her face lit up with a mixture of disbelief and pride. That joy, the recognition of achievement after years of self-doubt, had always been my reward. I realized then that my influence had never been about applause or recognition. It had always been about connection. Each student represented a small victory of understanding, a tiny rebellion against the world's assumption that ordinary people could not change their circumstances. And now, in the courtroom, the very lessons I had imparted, the quiet, consistent mentorship, were poised to take on a different significance. The judge's acknowledgement, subtle yet profound, was a reminder that the work done in shadows sometimes casts the longest light. I remembered another detail about the night school, the diversity of struggles each student brought into the classroom. Some had been homeless, others had been in trouble with the law, some had been failed by schools that moved too quickly, while others had been burdened by responsibilities at home. Every night, I had to adapt, to read the room, to meet each student where they were emotionally and intellectually. That adaptability, developed over years of patient guidance, had taught me more than any formal career ever could. It had prepared me for moments like today, where the subtle accumulation of knowledge and influence became as powerful as any formal authority. A small, almost forgotten incident came to mind. A young girl named Lily had arrived one evening carrying a box of donated books, determined to help her classmates catch up. She had no idea how to tutor others herself, but her heart was willing and her persistence was inspiring. I guided her in small ways, teaching her how to explain concepts clearly, how to encourage her peers without overstepping. Weeks later, she had become a quiet leader in the class, helping others while learning herself. That simple act of mentorship, multiplied dozens of times, had quietly shaped a network of support that extended beyond the walls of that room. And now, That very skill of nurturing potential seemed to have reached the courtroom in the form of recognition from someone I had indirectly influenced years ago. Even the small mistakes my students made were lessons in disguise. I remembered one student, Javier, who had miscalculated a budget exercise repeatedly. Each failure frustrated him. And at first, it frustrated me too, but I realized that patience and explanation were the only way forward. I broke down the problem into smaller, digestible pieces, illustrating each step with real-world examples. By the end of the lesson, Javier had not only corrected his errors, but understood why the mistakes mattered. That moment, small and almost invisible to outsiders, was precisely the kind of quiet, transformative work that had built my reputation without fanfare. And all these moments, accumulated over years, contrasted sharply with the stepson who had just mocked me in the courtroom. Michael had never seen the hours of preparation, the late nights spent patiently guiding someone who doubted themselves, or the careful observation of human behavior required to nurture growth. He had thought that charm, sarcasm, and arrogance would protect him from accountability. But the truth was that he had grown up surrounded by the subtle influence of someone who had quietly demanded more from him than he realized. I remembered walking through the night school corridors after the last student had left, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly above. I would often linger, arranging papers, tidying supplies, or simply reflecting on the progress made that evening. The quiet of the empty classroom, broken only by the faint hum of heating vents, had always felt sacred, a reminder that small, consistent effort can yield profound change. It was in these moments, surrounded by empty desks and echoing footsteps, that I had understood the true power of mentorship. As the memories faded, I refocused on the courtroom. The recognition I had glimpsed in the judge's eyes was not about titles or wealth. It was about understanding. He had seen, perhaps indirectly, the years of patient guidance, the countless lives quietly transformed, and he understood that the person standing before him, mocked by her stepson, was someone who had shaped more futures than many would ever realize. That recognition, subtle yet undeniable, shifted the energy in the room. The laughter that had initially aimed to diminish me now felt hollow, out of place, compared to the weight of quiet influence that surrounded me. And in that charged silence, I realized something else. My work at night school had always been about more than instruction. It had been about connection, empathy, and understanding. Every student who had once doubted themselves, every small triumph and failure, had built a mosaic of experience and authority that I had carried quietly without fanfare. Today, that mosaic was visible in the most unexpected place, a courtroom where my stepson had intended to belittle me but had instead highlighted the depth of influence that comes from patience, knowledge, and unwavering dedication. I had barely settled back into my chair after recalling the nights at the night school when the weight of the courtroom's silence shifted. All attention had subtly started to turn toward Michael again, and I could feel the faint pulse of tension rolling through him. He shifted in his seat, shoulders stiffening, fingers tapping nervously on the polished wooden armrest. That smug arrogance he wore like armor was beginning to crack under the subtle, unspoken pressure of scrutiny, and I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. His mistakes weren't small, though he had acted like they were. Michael had underestimated how easily a single oversight could unravel months of lies. I had discovered the first hints while tidying the kitchen one afternoon, months before this court date. There were receipts tucked under the couch cushions, half-filled ledgers he had left carelessly open on the dining table, and a crumpled envelope marked with sums that didn't match the bank statements he had nonchalantly left on his desk. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it might be nothing, but the numbers didn't add up. Something had gone terribly wrong, and I was already too familiar with the patterns of mistakes young men convinced of their invincibility could make. I had spent the next few weeks quietly observing him. Every time he left the house, I watched his movements through small, unobtrusive gestures. His phone was constantly glued to his ear, messages deleted too quickly, apps open for too short a time to catch anything meaningful. He had thought I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I wouldn't care. But I did. I always cared. And I was patient. That patience had been my quiet weapon all these years, the same weapon I had used to guide countless night school students through struggles they never thought they could overcome. One evening, I followed a trail of small clues that revealed more than I expected. Michael had been manipulating coworkers at his part-time job, convincing one to cover for a missing deposit, persuading another to overlook discrepancies in inventory. Each little lie felt like a dagger aimed at the trust one had tried to build with him over the years. I felt a rush of both disappointment and inevitability. His mistakes weren't born of ignorance. They were born of arrogance, the same arrogance I had seen in students like Marcus, who initially refused to learn but eventually recognized the consequences of ignoring guidance. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table late that night, a cup of tea cooling beside me, staring at the half-filled spreadsheet he had left behind. Each entry told a story, a pattern, and I traced every irregularity with methodical precision. The excitement, the fear, and the resignation all mixed in my chest. I was preparing not only for the possibility of consequences, but for the courtroom confrontation I knew was inevitable. I didn't need to act yet. Observation was its own form of strategy. The first time I directly confronted Michael about his actions, it was quiet, almost mundane. He had been lounging on the couch, headphones on, scrolling through social media. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and asked a simple question. "Michael, can we talk about the ledger I found?" He didn't even look up. "What ledger?" he said, feigning ignorance. That casual deflection was familiar to me. I had faced it countless times in students who initially resisted accountability. The one with the deposits that don't match the bank records. I said calmly. His eyes flicked toward mine, and I saw the first spark of panic, not enough to break him, but enough to confirm my suspicions. Over the next few days, the tension escalated. I observed him trying to correct mistakes hastily, sometimes erasing digital records or moving documents to places he thought I wouldn't notice. Every misstep, every attempt to cover up, revealed more about his character and left a breadcrumb trail I knew I could follow. I had grown skilled at seeing these patterns. Each small deception only reinforced what I already knew. Michael's arrogance had created his own undoing. There was one particularly telling moment that brought the scale of his mistakes home. He had attempted to falsify a payment receipt at work, confident that no one would cross-check it. That evening, I happened to notice a faint ink smudge on the receipt he left on the counter. I held it up to the light, tracing the subtle differences between his markings and the legitimate forms he had been taught to replicate. It was sloppy, amateurish, and it confirmed everything I had suspected: his lack of diligence, his overconfidence, and his reckless underestimation of accountability. I could feel my heart pounding as I traced the lines, not with fear, but with a measured clarity. I knew that this moment, though seemingly small, would eventually surface in court. His mistakes weren't just financial. They were behavioral, moral misjudgments that reflected the choices he had repeatedly refused to examine. I had seen this before in so many students who thought charm could replace effort. And in this moment, I realized that years of patient mentorship had prepared me to speak to the reality of consequences in a way Michael would never anticipate. At home, the atmosphere became tense. He avoided eye contact, moved around cautiously, and sometimes muttered under his breath when he thought I wasn't listening. I never had to follow him aggressively. His own mistakes created a trail of evidence. The late-night texts he forgot to delete, the hurried phone calls, the ledger entries, every small slip added up. It was almost cinematic in its inevitability, like watching a storm build from a distant horizon. There was also an emotional dimension that complicated everything. Michael wasn't just reckless, he was deeply conflicted. I could see the hints of guilt in his body language, how his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching, how his voice faltered when he addressed me directly. He had been shielded from consequences for so long that every error now became a test of his fragile pride. And in that tension, I found both sadness and a strange satisfaction. Sadness for the choices he had made and the lessons he had ignored. Satisfaction because, finally, the truth was unavoidable. One afternoon, I had to step into a moment of confrontation that was both tender and tense. Michael had left an important financial form in plain view. I picked it up calmly and called him over. "Michael, this doesn't match the bank statements again. We need to address it," I said quietly. His hands trembled as he took the form, and for the first time, I saw him truly afraid, not of me, but of the consequences he could no longer avoid. "What if I just fix it before anyone notices?" he said, desperation creeping into his voice. I looked at him steadily. "Then you are only delaying the inevitable, and you're learning nothing. You've had guidance, examples, and patience, yet you've chosen to ignore them. That will change nothing unless you face the truth." Those words hung between us, charged with years of frustration and care. I wasn't lecturing. I wasn't trying to humiliate him. I was simply stating a fact. The path he had chosen had led him here, and the mistakes he thought were minor were now undeniable. In the days leading up to court, the weight of his errors began to crystallize into a narrative I could present. I went over the evidence methodically, connecting each irregularity in the ledger, each misleading phone call, and each attempted cover-up into a coherent pattern. This wasn't about revenge. It was about honesty, integrity, and accountability. Michael's mistakes had created a story, and I would be the one to tell it, truthfully, clearly, and without embellishment. One evening, as I prepared my notes, I remembered how similar situations had unfolded in my night school classes. Students who had initially resisted learning had faced consequences too, and the lesson had always been the same. Avoidance only delays reality. Each small failure, each overlooked detail, eventually surfaced in a moment of reckoning. Michael was no different. His arrogance had blinded him to the simple truth that neglect and deception cannot remain hidden forever. Even more revealing were his attempts to manipulate others into covering for him. At his part-time job, he had convinced coworkers to overlook discrepancies, arguing persuasively that the mistakes were minor and that no one would notice. I had spoken to those same coworkers, quietly, gently asking questions and observing their reactions. Their discomfort, their subtle hesitation, and the glances exchanged among them painted a clear picture. Michael's charm and bravado could not override the reality of the errors he had created. The night before the trial, I went over every detail again, not as a stepmother trying to punish, but as a mentor who had watched patterns emerge for years. I knew where he had erred, why he had erred, and how to present the truth without embellishment. I had seen this narrative before, not in my stepson, but in students like Marcus, Elise, and Thomas. Each had thought they could evade responsibility. Each had eventually faced the consequences with a mixture of fear and growth. Michael would be no different. When the courtroom finally reconvened, the evidence I had quietly documented, the ledgers, the phone records, the mismanaged receipts, was presented. The narrative unfolded not as a lecture, not as a vindictive attack, but as a clear chain of cause and effect. Michael had attempted to dismiss me earlier with laughter, but now the pattern of his mistakes could not be ignored. Each misstep was laid bare, and the weight of his choices pressed down on him visibly. He sat frozen, eyes darting between the judge, the attorneys, and me. The arrogance that had once shielded him was gone. replaced by a tension I could almost touch. His mistakes, once small and seemingly insignificant, had now become undeniable. The quiet mentorship I had cultivated for years, combined with the patient observation of his behavior, had brought every error into the light. Even in the midst of tension, I felt a strange, quiet relief. The reckoning had not come through shouting or punishment, but through truth. Michael's mistakes had emerged naturally from his actions, and my role was simply to articulate them clearly, calmly, and honestly. The classroom lessons, the quiet nights of mentorship, the subtle guidance I had provided, all of it had converged in this moment, illuminating the consequences of neglect, arrogance, and ignored wisdom. The courtroom felt heavier now, every heartbeat echoing in my ears. Michael's defiance, once so loud and careless, had begun to falter under the weight of his mistakes now laid bare. I could see it in the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped the table in nervous rhythm, and the slight flicker in his eyes that betrayed fear he was unwilling to admit. He had tried to silence me with mockery. He had thought his charm and sarcasm would shield him from accountability. But that illusion was breaking. Then it happened. The judge, who had remained calm throughout, finally leaned forward, his fingers steepled on the desk, eyes narrowing with focus. "Ms. Brielle," he said, his voice deliberate but commanding, "you've mentioned your mentorship work at the night school. Could you explain precisely how it relates to the case before us?" A hush fell over the room. I felt the tension coil in my stomach, but there was no fear this time. Only clarity. Years of guiding students, observing patterns of mistakes, and patiently cultivating understanding had led to this precise moment. I straightened my shoulders, meeting the judge's gaze evenly. "Your Honor," I began, "the lessons I teach at the night school revolve around accountability, understanding consequences, and recognizing how small decisions accumulate into larger outcomes. In this case, the steps taken by my stepson mirror the patterns I have seen countless times before: misjudgments compounded by arrogance, attempts to evade responsibility, and the dismissal of guidance offered by others." Michael's smug expression faltered. His mouth opened as if to argue, but the judge's stern gaze cut him off before a single word could leave his lips. "Please continue," the judge said, eyes locked on me. "Be specific. Detail what guidance was ignored and what consequences were predictable." I felt a rush of calm as I began laying out the facts. I described the ledger entries Michael had mishandled, the receipts he had altered, and the phone calls he had made to manipulate coworkers. I didn't dramatize. I didn't raise my voice. I simply traced the chain of events logically, step by step, showing how his errors were the natural result of choices he had made, and how they aligned with patterns I had witnessed in students who ignored guidance. There was a subtle shift in the room. Even the jurors leaned forward slightly, as if absorbing the weight of the explanation. The defense attorney frowned, realizing the foundation of their strategy. The idea that Michael's mistakes were minor or accidental was crumbling. Michael, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to regain composure but unable to mask the panic creeping into his movements. I continued. "In my work with students at the night school, I have seen similar behaviors: initial defiance, followed by repeated mistakes, and a growing realization of consequences once guidance is ignored. I have also seen transformation when accountability is embraced. The pattern is clear and predictable, and in this case, it has unfortunately gone unheeded until now." The judge's face softened slightly as he nodded. I recognized that spark again, the subtle recognition that this wasn't just a housewife's opinion, but the testimony of someone whose guidance had shaped lives quietly and effectively. It was a weight that carried authority without pomp. Michael's earlier laughter now seemed almost foolish, echoing against the firm reality of demonstrated expertise and credibility. Then, almost imperceptibly, one of the jurors shifted, glancing at Michael with a raised brow. I noticed the change in atmosphere. An acknowledgement, unspoken but clear, that the person who had claimed to be insignificant had, in fact, wielded knowledge and insight far beyond what had been assumed. Michael's attempts at charm and ridicule no longer shielded him. He was exposed not just to evidence, but to the undeniable reality of my experience. I shared a few small anecdotes from my mentorship work, not to boast, but to illustrate that I understood patterns of behavior and their consequences. I described a student, Marcus, who initially defied every instruction, ignored guidance, and compounded small mistakes into larger ones. Yet, under patient instruction, he began to recognize the pattern, take responsibility, and transform his behavior. I explained how these lessons applied directly to the missteps before us, repeated errors, attempts at evasion, and the importance of confronting consequences rather than hiding from them. Michael's hands fidgeted. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, attempting to focus on some point of strategy or distraction, but he could not escape the gravity of the moment. I could almost hear his internal panic. She knows. She has always known. He had grown up under my guidance and ignored it, thinking I was powerless. Now, every choice he had made and every misjudgment he had thought insignificant was laid bare, illuminated by the authority of experience and observation that he had always dismissed. The courtroom seemed to tighten around me. I could hear the faint rustle of papers, the soft scratch of pens as notes were taken, and the quiet inhale of someone processing the testimony. Even the court reporter paused briefly, catching the cadence of my voice, the steady rhythm of a woman who had observed, guided, and understood patterns of human behavior for years. There was power in that recognition, quiet but undeniable. I noticed a subtle reaction from Michael that spoke volumes. His foot tapped nervously against the floor, a gesture he often made when anxious. He leaned back in his chair, shoulders slumping slightly, and avoided eye contact. The grin that had been his armor in previous court appearances had vanished. The laughter that was meant to diminish me now hung in the air, hollow and ineffective against the gravity of truth. I pressed on, carefully detailing the financial discrepancies and connecting them to the behavioral patterns I had observed. I avoided judgmental language, keeping my tone steady, factual, and professional. The clarity of the explanation itself seemed to silence mockery. The courtroom, which had been tense, now held a tangible weight, as if the air had thickened with acknowledgement. At one point, the judge interjected, his voice calm but deliberate. "Ms. Brielle, could you specify the moments where guidance was offered and ignored? It will help the court understand the chain of events." I nodded and leaned slightly forward, tracing each instance meticulously, the conversations at home, the worksheets left unattended, the corrections I had offered that had been brushed aside, the careful mentorship lessons in patience and accountability. Each instance formed a coherent timeline that was impossible to dismiss. Michael's eyes widened subtly at each detailed account. He realized, finally, that his earlier mockery had been not just unwise, but counterproductive. The authority I had cultivated through years of patient mentorship now carried weight in the most public, inescapable arena. I could feel the satisfaction of quiet vindication building, not in a vindictive way, but in the sense of truth being recognized. The jurors were visibly engaged, leaning forward, eyes following my words. One older woman shifted in her seat and nodded subtly, as if recognizing the patterns in her own family or past experiences. Another juror scribbled notes quickly, perhaps impressed by the clarity and relevance of the testimony. Even the attorneys, both defense and prosecution, now treated my statements with measured respect. I shared one more anecdote, a subtle but powerful example from the night school. I described a student named Elise, a woman returning to education after years of neglect and self-doubt. She had resisted guidance at first, made repeated mistakes, and seemed destined to fail. Yet, under patient observation and careful instruction, she began to internalize lessons and correct her behavior. I drew parallels carefully, repeated mistakes, ignored advice, and eventual reckoning. This illustration, modest as it seemed, landed heavily in the room. At that moment, the judge leaned back slightly and gave a faint nod. Recognition was no longer subtle. It was clear. My presence, my credibility, and my lived experience had shifted the energy of the courtroom. Michael's mockery had been silenced, not by confrontation, but by the undeniable authority of truth. The boy who had laughed at me was now facing the reality of his errors with every small detail accounted for. I noticed his subtle reactions, a flicker of shame, the tightening of his fists, the slight avoidance of my gaze. Every instinct I had honed through years of mentorship allowed me to read him like an open book. He was beginning to internalize what I had been saying, not with understanding yet, but with recognition that his earlier behavior was unsustainable. The judge spoke again, this time addressing Michael directly. It appears that the evidence and the testimony provided by Ms. Brielle clearly outlines the choices made and the consequences that followed. Do you wish to respond? Michael hesitated. His usual arrogance faltered completely, replaced by a tense, almost childlike discomfort. The laughter that had once punctuated his disdain was gone, replaced by silence heavy with awareness of the situation's seriousness. I sat quietly, allowing the truth to stand on its own. There was no need for dramatics, no need for vindictive words. The authority had emerged naturally from years of observation, mentorship, and patient guidance. I had never sought recognition in the classroom, never sought applause, but now, in this moment, recognition had arrived, unbidden and undeniable. Even the courtroom staff seemed to sense the shift. The bailiff adjusted his posture slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of the gravity of the testimony. The clerks leaned forward as they typed, capturing each word with precision. And in the center of it all, Michael sat frozen, forced to confront the reality of the patterns he had ignored, the guidance he had dismissed, and the woman he had once deemed insignificant. I took a slow breath, feeling the calm clarity that comes from truth being recognized. Every patient night, every mentoring session, every quiet act of guidance had led to this precise moment. The laughter that had attempted to diminish me had been replaced with silence, understanding, and acknowledgement. Recognition had arrived not from titles or force, but from the undeniable weight of experience and insight. In the quiet aftermath of my testimony, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. Michael's shoulders slumped. His mouth opened, then closed. The defense attorney shifted uneasily, and I, Brielle, ordinary in outward appearance but extraordinary in quiet influence, realized that the mockery had been permanently silenced, not by anger, not by confrontation, but by the truth that could not be ignored. The courtroom emptied slowly after the judge's final words. Michael sat frozen for a moment, staring down at his folded hands, the weight of realization pressing down on him. The others filed out, murmuring quietly, leaving behind only the faint echo of footsteps against polished floors. I stayed seated for a heartbeat longer, letting the moment sink in. There was no triumphant applause, no dramatic declarations. The victory was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly satisfying. It was the kind of victory that comes from truth being recognized, patience being acknowledged, and integrity prevailing. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and clean, and I felt it wash over the tension that had clung to my shoulders all morning. For years, I had quietly worked to guide those around me, from my students to my stepson, and now the recognition wasn't loud. It was palpable in the understanding in people's eyes, the subtle respect in their nods, and the knowledge that I had remained steadfast while chaos threatened to pull everything apart. I remembered walking to the car afterward, the city streets buzzing faintly with life, oblivious to the quiet victory that had unfolded inside the courthouse. My mind drifted to Michael, and despite everything, I felt a twinge of sadness. The court had revealed his mistakes publicly, but it had also presented an opportunity. I hoped he would learn, not out of fear, but from reflection, a lesson I had always believed was more powerful than punishment. The drive home was reflective. I thought about the long nights at the night school, the countless students who had once doubted themselves, and the small triumphs that had built their confidence. I thought of Marcus, Elise, Carla, and Thomas, the young people who had transformed not because I forced them, but because I guided them patiently. Michael's reckoning, I realized, was another form of that transformation, just more painful and public. At home, I entered the quiet kitchen, the familiar smell of brewed coffee lingering faintly from the morning. Michael was sitting at the table, staring at the floor, a subtle change in demeanor that was almost imperceptible. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a mixture of discomfort, reflection, and curiosity. I didn't speak immediately. I poured myself a cup of tea and let the silence linger, letting him process in his own way. Finally, he looked up, his eyes avoiding mine, voice low. I didn't think it would all come out like that. He admitted. The confession was small, almost hesitant, but it was a start. Years of defiance and arrogance could not disappear overnight, but acknowledgement of mistakes was the first step toward change. I nodded slowly, keeping my tone calm and measured. It's not about embarrassment, Michael. It's about understanding the consequences of your actions and learning from them. You had guidance. You had opportunity. The rest is up to you. My words weren't harsh. They were deliberate, meant to open a door rather than slam it shut. He swallowed and nodded, still avoiding eye contact. I think I understand, he murmured. It wasn't a triumphant declaration, but it carried a weight of sincerity that I hadn't heard before. The journey toward accountability had begun, quietly and deliberately, just as it had with my students over the years. That evening, I returned to the night school to check on my students. The familiar fluorescent lights and the hum of quiet chatter welcomed me. In their faces, I saw the same curiosity, the same eagerness to grow that I had witnessed for years. They had no idea of the morning's events, and it didn't matter. The work I did, whether recognized publicly or not, was about transformation, guidance, and the quiet accumulation of wisdom. Carlo approached me with a hesitant smile. "Ms. Brielle," she said, voice low, "I've been working on that budgeting exercise you gave me last week. I think I finally understand it." Her pride was subtle but evident, and I felt a quiet warmth at the recognition in her eyes. Each small success, each moment of learning was a testament to the patience, persistence, and mentorship I had cultivated, not just in the courtroom, but in everyday life. I lingered with the students longer than usual, helping Marcus with a tricky problem set and guiding Elise through a complex scenario she had been struggling with for weeks. Each interaction was deliberate, measured, and full of attention. I had learned over years that small gestures, consistent guidance, and patience could create profound change. The classroom was my arena for quiet victories, where laughter, learning, and understanding formed the backbone of transformation. Meanwhile, Michael's presence at home created subtle tension. He didn't lash out. He didn't act defiantly. Instead, he began to listen, occasionally asking questions, sometimes hesitating but seeking clarification. The shift was quiet but tangible. I realized that the courtroom had served as a catalyst, but the real work, the slow, patient rebuilding of accountability, trust, and understanding, was only beginning. One evening, Michael approached me as I was grading student work. "Ms. Brielle," he said, hesitating. "Can you help me understand how to organize my finances? I I want to get it right this time." The request was small, but monumental. It was an acknowledgement of error and a willingness to learn, a rare moment of humility in someone who had once been dismissive of guidance. I smiled softly. "Of course," I said. "Let's start with the basics. One step at a time." And we did. Over the next few hours, I guided him through budgeting, responsible record keeping, and recognizing potential pitfalls. The lessons were practical, rooted in experience, and quietly transformative. I saw the tension in his shoulders ease as understanding began to replace confusion and defiance. The next week brought another small but meaningful incident. Michael accidentally left a financial record incomplete, and instead of panicking or trying to hide it, he approached me. "I think I made a mistake," he admitted quietly. I guided him calmly through correction, emphasizing the value of transparency and accountability. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. He was learning not just the mechanics of responsibility, but the integrity that accompanied it. Even at the night school, I noticed a parallel pattern emerging. Students who had once struggled to accept guidance were observing this subtle transformation in Michael. His journey mirrored the lessons I had instilled in them for years. Mistakes are inevitable, but recognition, accountability, and corrective action create growth. The environment became more reflective, more engaged, as the presence of learning from consequences unfolded quietly alongside mentorship. Another incident stood out vividly. Michael attempted to reconcile his own mistakes with a small act of generosity, helping a fellow student who had encountered a similar financial oversight. His offer wasn't grandiose. It was modest, sincere, and meaningful. I recognized the same patterns in countless students who had embraced lessons quietly and deliberately. The transformation was not instantaneous, but it was unmistakable. He was beginning to internalize the principles I had always valued: honesty, accountability, and proactive guidance. I spent the following weeks guiding him patiently, incorporating lessons from both home and the night school. He began keeping meticulous records, asking questions when unsure, and learning to anticipate potential errors before they escalated. Each step forward was quiet, almost imperceptible, but cumulatively profound. I realized that this was the true essence of mentorship, not immediate results, but the slow, steady cultivation of understanding and responsibility. One evening, as I tidied the classroom after students had left, I reflected on the journey, the courtroom mockery, the stepson's mistakes, and the long hours of patient guidance at the night school, all intertwined in a web of cause and effect. Every small incident, the ledgers, the missteps, the hesitant confessions, had led to a quiet but profound victory. The laughter that once sought to diminish me had been replaced by recognition, accountability, and growth. Michael approached me silently, holding a notebook. I think I'm starting to get it," he said. There was humility in his tone, a quiet acknowledgement of lessons learned. It was not dramatic or showy, but the subtlety made it even more profound. The transformation was internal, real, and lasting. I realized then that victory does not always come with applause or grand recognition. True victory is quiet, earned through patience, consistency, and the willingness to guide without immediate reward. It comes when those you've mentored begin to take responsibility for their actions, embrace their mistakes, and commit to learning. The courtroom had acknowledged my role, but the real triumph was unfolding in the daily, almost invisible moments of growth, understanding, and subtle change. The next morning, I returned to the night school to find Marcus tackling a particularly challenging problem set. Elise approached me, excitedly showing how she had applied a principle we had discussed to a real-world scenario. Carla shared a small success, her face lighting up with pride. And in the background, Michael quietly organized his own notes, asking a question here, making a correction there. The quiet hum of learning, accountability, and transformation filled the room, a resonance far deeper than any courtroom acknowledgement. As I closed the classroom for the night, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of effort and patience. The stepson's laughter, once sharp and dismissive, had been replaced by reflection, accountability, and subtle growth. The night school had always been a place of quiet victories, and now the lessons extended into my home as well. I realized that mentorship, patience, and unwavering dedication could create change, even in those who seemed most resistant. I sat at the desk for a moment, sipping tea, reflecting on the journey. The courtroom had provided recognition, but the real victory was far quieter, more profound, and infinitely more satisfying. I had guided, observed, and taught, and now the results were unfolding not in dramatic confrontation, but in subtle, meaningful change. Michael's mistakes had led to learning. His arrogance had been tempered by accountability, and I had remained steadfast, patient, and unshakable throughout. The lesson was clear. True influence is quiet, persistent, and transformative. It doesn't seek attention. It doesn't demand recognition, but its effects ripple outward, shaping lives, building character, and silencing mockery without a word of hostility. I had learned that over years at the night school, and now I had seen it come full circle in the most unexpected yet profoundly satisfying way. I turned off the lights and stepped out into the cool night air, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a victory that was earned, deep and lasting. The world outside moved on, unaware of the small triumphs that had unfolded, but I knew, and sometimes knowing quietly, watching transformation unfold with your own guidance, is the most powerful recognition of all. As I finally closed the door behind me that night, I paused and let myself breathe, letting the quiet weight of everything that had unfolded settle around me. The courtroom drama, Michael's mistakes, the subtle unraveling of his arrogance, and the recognition I had quietly earned, all of it pressed into my chest like a storm that had finally passed. I realized then that the loudest battles are often not fought with voices or anger, but with patience, observation, and unwavering conviction. For years, I had nurtured, guided, and mentored, not because anyone had demanded it, not for recognition, and certainly not for applause, but because I believed in the power of understanding, accountability, and growth. That belief had been tested in ways I never anticipated, not in the safe confines of a classroom or night school, but in the real, unforgiving world where personal mistakes carry consequences that ripple far beyond the individual. And yet, here I was standing quietly victorious, watching the subtle shifts in those around me, the small but meaningful change in Michael, the genuine curiosity in my students, the quiet respect that lingered in the air. The victory wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about witnessing the truth of effort, guidance, and patience finally taking root. Michael had learned something he would carry for the rest of his life, whether he realized it immediately or not. Arrogance and mockery can shield you temporarily, but accountability, humility, and reflection leave a far deeper impression. He had begun to take the first real steps toward responsibility, and that transformation, quiet as it was, felt infinitely more powerful than any courtroom applause. I felt proud, not because I had won, but because I had upheld the principles I believed in and had quietly influenced someone to confront their own mistakes. Life, I realized, is full of moments like this, subtle, almost invisible victories that shape us far more than the public ones we chase. Sitting in the dim glow of the living room, I understood that mentorship, patience, and persistence are forces of change that transcend recognition. I had faced mockery, skepticism, and underestimation, yet I had remained steadfast. The quiet triumphs, The smiles on my students' faces, the tentative questions from Michael, the sense of integrity restored, were worth every sleepless night, every whispered encouragement, every moment of patience. And as I watched Michael finally attempt a small task correctly, his expression a mixture of concentration and uncertainty, I knew this was just the beginning of his journey. The lessons had taken hold, quietly and irrevocably shaping him in ways that would outlast any fleeting embarrassment or misstep. I leaned back in my chair, sipping tea, feeling a sense of completeness that could not be shaken. Victory does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, nurtures, and endures, and in that quiet endurance it becomes eternal. Tonight, I had witnessed that truth, not just in Michael, but in myself, in the work I had devoted my life to, and in the subtle power of guidance that transforms lives in ways both profound and lasting.